It was a cold Sunday in late November when Melissa found the photo, not tucked away or hidden, just sitting there, stupidly, boldly, in her husband's email drafts folder. A selfie of Simon with another woman, young and suntanned, lying beside him in a hotel bed that wasn't theirs. He hadn't even sent it, just saved it, as if the act of drafting the message, "Thinking of you already," was enough. Melissa closed the laptop without breathing. Her heart didn't race. It slowed, like her body was recalibrating. Her first thought wasn't about the woman. It wasn't even about Simon. It was, why didn't I see it sooner? Simon Harding was 43, a cybersecurity consultant with a quiet demeanor and a mind that never stopped working, even when his marriage had. He was meticulous, composed, the kind of man who arranged his socks by color and built spreadsheets for family vacations. Melissa, 2 years younger, was a family. Therapist, ironic, she sometimes joked, given the state of her own marriage. She used to find comfort in their routines, the way they shared morning silence, his habit of bringing her jasmine tea when she worked late. But over the past year, that comfort had soured into distance. They had been married for 15 years. No children, by choice, at first. Then, not entirely. That night, Melissa didn't confront him. Instead, she sat in the bathroom with the door locked and stared at her reflection. Her face looked hollow, not angry, just paused. She cleared her browser history, printed the photo, and placed it in a worn copy of Anna Karenina, folding the edges until the image distorted. The betrayal wasn't just in the act, it was in the carelessness, the audacity, the silence. 2 weeks later, Simon noticed, not right away, but in her pauses. Her gaze lingered on him too long, and her touch had vanished. They still shared meals, still brushed teeth side by side, but everything had turned performative. Like actors running lines from a play neither believed in anymore. "Is something wrong?" he asked one night while she loaded the dishwasher. "No," she said too quickly. "You're distant." She closed the dishwasher gently. "So are you." Simon stared at her, uncertain if this was the moment to say something, anything. But he let the silence win. Enter Cal Jennings, Simon's business partner. Charismatic, single, and too observant for his own good. Cal noticed Melissa's tension at a holiday party, her tight smile when Simon tried to take her hand. Later, over bourbon, Cal cornered Simon outside. "Is this about Camilla?" Simon stiffened. "I don't want to talk about that. You need to." "She knows, doesn't she?" Simon didn't answer. "Just so you know," Cal added, "Camilla's not who you think she is." "What do you mean?" Cal shrugged. "Do some digging. I had her vetted when you started pulling away at work. Let's just say she's got a type. Married men with money. Investigation. Melissa couldn't ignore the instinct. Her therapist's mind needed answers. Not just the why, but the how, the when, the who else. She hired a private investigator, Jane Ewan, a sharp, unapologetic woman who believed in truth more than tact. Within a week, Jane returned with a file. Camilla had a history. Several affairs, a sealed harassment lawsuit, and a mysterious connection to one of Simon's firm's competitors. "You think she's using him?" Melissa asked. "I think she's very good at what she does," Jane replied. "But I also think your husband is a grown man." Confrontation. When Melissa finally confronted Simon, it was quiet. No shouting, no slamming doors. She laid the photo on the kitchen island and watched him flinch. "I know about her. I know about the hotel in Miami. I know you saved the message." Simon swallowed hard, blinking at the photo like it might vanish. If he stared long enough. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "Are you sorry you did it? Or sorry you got caught?" He didn't answer. Melissa exhaled, tears threatening but not yet free. "How long?" 5 months. It ended 2 weeks ago. "Why?" Simon looked down. "I don't know. I felt invisible, at home, like we were roommates who occasionally kissed out of habit. Melissa laughed bitterly. So you found someone to make you feel seen? He didn't deny it. The aftermath, the weeks blurred. They went to couples therapy. Simon quit the firm. Cal sold his shares. Melissa considered a trial separation, but changed her mind the day she saw Simon sobbing alone in the living room with their wedding album open on his lap. They lived in limbo, sleeping in separate rooms, eating together sometimes. There were moments of closeness, like muscle memory, then moments of raw distance. One evening, they had dinner with Melissa's sister Julia and her husband. Julia knew. She was the only one Melissa had told. Her quiet judgment hovered all night like a shadow. Afterward, she told Melissa, "Staying doesn't make you weak, but ask yourself, do you want to heal together or apart?" Melissa didn't answer. 1 year later, Simon found work consulting for nonprofits. Melissa published an article in a mental health journal about betrayal trauma. They still lived in the same house. Some nights, they talked for hours. Other nights, they barely spoke. Camilla? Gone. Rumor was she fled to New York. Simon never reached out. Melissa sometimes imagined leaving, starting over, finding someone new. Other times, she saw Simon smiling at her across the kitchen table and wondered if forgiveness was a kind of rebellion. Final scene. They sat on a park bench, watching a jogger chase her golden retriever through fallen leaves. The air smelled like rain. Simon turned to her. "Do you ever think we'll be okay?" Melissa didn't respond right away. She looked at his face. Tired, older, softer. He looked back at her like he still wasn't sure if he was allowed. "I think we're not the same," she said finally. "But maybe we're still worth the fight." They didn't hold hands. They just sat there side by side in silence. Ending open, bittersweet. A relationship splintered, not shattered. Trust fractured but not beyond repair. Love complicated. Forgiveness uncertain. The future blurred like the skyline in a drizzle. Whether they would survive it, that was a story still unfolding. The house was quieter now. Not with the silence of tension, but something more ambiguous. Neutral, tired, like two people waiting in separate rooms of a museum, unsure whether to continue the tour or leave altogether. Melissa kept her wedding ring in a small ceramic dish near the sink. She hadn't worn it in months, but she still cleaned it every Sunday morning. Habit. Ritual. Maybe a symbol of something she couldn't name. Simon had stopped asking her to talk. He gave her space, offered small gestures instead. A fixed drawer that had been jammed for a year. Her favorite chocolate left on her nightstand. A playlist he made filled with songs from the early years of their marriage. Some days, she hated him for it. Other days, she found herself replaying the songs on long drives. Enter. Detective Elena Hart. Detective Hart arrived at their door one Tuesday morning, a sharp-eyed woman in her 50s with a clipped voice and a folder in hand. Simon Harding. Simon blinked. "Yes?" "Do you know a woman named Camilla Reyes?" Melissa stood just behind him, heart thudding. "I did. We were involved briefly," Simon admitted. "Why?" Hart didn't blink. "She's under investigation for financial fraud, money laundering. She used your name and credentials to gain access to encrypted data from your former company." Melissa inhaled sharply. Simon paled. I didn't know." "You're not under arrest, but we need your cooperation." Melissa watched his face. This wasn't just about infidelity anymore. This was criminal. "You let her in," she whispered after the detective left. "You gave her access to everything." "I didn't know," he said again, but it sounded thinner this time. More like a prayer than a defense. Emotional fallout Melissa sat on the floor of their bedroom that night. The file Jane had compiled on Camilla spread around her like puzzle pieces. She didn't cry. Not this time. This wasn't just betrayal of the heart. It was betrayal of trust on every level. Their home, their safety, their names. Simon entered quietly, stood in the doorway, like a man waiting for his sentence. "You didn't just cheat," she said softly. "You compromised everything." "I know," he murmured. "I've been working with Cal to clean it up. I didn't want to tell you until I was sure it wouldn't touch you." "That wasn't your choice to make." His shoulders slumped. "I know." The choice weeks passed. Melissa spoke to a lawyer, then packed a suitcase. She moved into a rental near Volunteer Park, a small space with too much echo and not enough warmth. She told friends they were taking time, which was half true. Therapy became her refuge, not as a professional, but as a client. She peeled back layers, why she stayed, why she didn't scream, why a part of her still missed him. Simon called. Left voicemails, never begged, just talked. "I miss your laugh," he said once, even when it was tired. "I'm trying," he said another time, "not to fix what broke, just to understand how I broke it." She never responded, but she listened to every word. Closure, or something like it. On a cloudy Thursday, they met again, a coffee shop halfway between her apartment and their old house. She wore a blue coat he hadn't seen before. He looked thinner. They sat. Didn't order. "I wanted to see you," he said. "I know. I'm not asking you to come back." Her gaze flicked to him. "Then why?" "Because I needed to tell you something in person." He slid a letter across the table. "It's everything I never said, and everything I should have. Yes, didn't touch it. Not yet." "I don't know if you'll ever forgive me," he said, "but I had to stop wondering and just say it." Melissa nodded slowly. The weight in her chest didn't lift, but it shifted, like a door cracked open in a room long sealed. Final lines. Later that night, she sat by her window, the city lights painting shadows across her face. She opened the letter, read it twice, then folded it neatly and placed it in her journal. She didn't call him. She didn't cry. She simply sat with it. All of it. The pain, the memories, the fragments of what they were. There was no clear ending. No reunion. No absolute goodbye. Just a woman learning how to breathe on her own again. And maybe, someday, deciding whether to open that door fully or close it for good. Bittersweet. Open. Real. Love isn't always about winning or losing. Sometimes, it's about learning what pieces of yourself are worth keeping even after the trust is gone. The months that followed fell into a strange rhythm, quietly healing, but never entirely whole. Melissa found a certain solace in solitude. She started hiking again, something she hadn't done in years. The silence of the woods became her confessional, her sanctuary. Each step felt like a conversation with herself, a way of remembering who she'd been before the betrayal, before the marriage had become a place of secrets. She saw clients again, too, carefully chosen ones, people walking through grief, through betrayal. She no longer had to imagine their pain. She knew it. That intimacy gave her an edge in therapy, but also cost her sleep. She kept seeing pieces of herself in their stories. Sometimes, at the end of a long session, she'd sit in her office after everyone had gone, staring at the bookshelf where their wedding photo had once sat. She didn't replace it with anything. She left the space empty. Simon's reckoning, Simon didn't date. He buried himself in work, now consulting for a cybersecurity firm that had reached out after the Camilla scandal became public in niche tech circles. Ironically, his mistake made him more valuable, someone who understood firsthand how easily trust could be weaponized. He turned the guest room into a workshop, spent late nights rebuilding old radios, repurposing them into Bluetooth speakers. It was menial, precise work. He liked the discipline of it. He saw his therapist twice a week, journaling obsessively in between. He stopped drinking, finally. Started walking instead, just aimless wanderings around Seattle with earbuds and no destination. What haunted him most wasn't the affair. It was the way Melissa had stopped looking at him like he was hers. Even when she was angry, she used to look at him with ownership. That was gone now. She looked at him like a stranger she'd once loved deeply and no longer trusted to carry the weight of her. One night, after a long walk past Gasworks Park, he emailed her. Not to beg or ask, just to tell her a memory. Do you remember that time we got lost driving to Leavenworth? You read the map upside down and we ended up at that empty lodge in the snow. We were so mad. But then we stayed. Made love by the fireplace. You said it felt like the universe had made a mistake that turned into a miracle. I've been thinking about that day a lot, about how sometimes we don't know we've left the road until it's too late. I wanted you to know I remember. It too. She didn't reply, but she did smile. A little. A new variable one night in late October, Melissa got a call from Jane. You should know, Camilla was arrested again, tried to disappear, had multiple passports. Simon was cleared, but her attorney mentioned she might try to flip the narrative. Melissa's mouth went dry. Meaning? Meaning she's painting herself as a woman manipulated by your husband. That he used her to cover tracks from the company's old data breach. It's nonsense, but media outlets love scandal. Melissa closed her eyes. He doesn't deserve that. No, Jane agreed. But he's also not fighting it. He's keeping quiet, letting her destroy herself. That's very him. Jane paused. You okay? No, Melissa said honestly. But I'm not falling apart either. A rainy reunion. By mid-November, they met again, accidentally. A bookshop on Capitol Hill. She was holding The Body Keeps the Score. He was leafing through Zen and the art of motorcycle maintenance. They both paused, then laughed nervously. Therapist classics, he said. Midlife crisis starter kit, she replied. They stood in silence for a moment before he asked, Coffee? Melissa looked at him. Not just at him, but into him. He looked more grounded, tired, still, but more honest, like someone who'd learned to live without armor. She nodded. At the cafe. The conversation was halting at first, then easy, then layered, with the strange intimacy that only ex-lovers share. Ones who still carry the blueprint of each other's hearts. They didn't talk about the affair, or Camilla, or trust. They talked about music, dreams, the way Seattle looked different now that they saw it alone. I'm not asking to fix it, he said gently toward the end. I'm not asking to forget it, she replied. So what do we do? Melissa stirred her tea. We leave it open, like a wound that's still healing, like a window that might close, or stay cracked. Simon looked away, nodded. Open works. They stood, hugged awkwardly, an embrace filled with memory and weight, and walked away in different directions. Final image weeks later, Melissa stood on her apartment balcony during the first snow of winter, holding her tea close, watching. The flakes blur the skyline. Inside, her phone buzzed with a message from Simon. A photo, that old snow lodge, now renovated. A simple caption beneath it, still here. Different, but still standing. She didn't reply. But she saved the picture. And this time, she didn't cry. Ending. Open, wistful, honest in another life. They might have made it. In this one, maybe they still will. Or maybe they'll just remember, each other kindly, from across the distance. Sometimes, survival isn't about winning love back. Sometimes, it's about learning to live with the silence left behind. The days stretched thinner in winter, the light more silver than gold. Melissa grew used to the quiet hum of her apartment, the absence of his keys in the bowl, the silence after brushing her teeth alone. But what surprised her most was how that silence stopped feeling like loss and started feeling like peace. She had rearranged the furniture 3 times, donated old wedding china, and started cooking meals that she liked, meals Simon never cared for. Little rituals of self-definition. But there were still moments. At the grocery store, she passed a man wearing his cologne, vetiver and cedar. Her breath caught. In therapy, a client described the moment she realized she no longer loved her husband. Melissa flinched because it wasn't true for her. She hadn't stopped loving Simon. That was the real ache. Simon's growth. Simon was rebuilding, quietly, stubbornly. Not the marriage, himself. He spoke at a cybersecurity panel in February, openly discussing the risks of emotional breaches, how vulnerability can compromise logic. His story wasn't just a cautionary tale. It became a conversation starter. After the panel, a young woman asked him, "What did you lose?" He answered without thinking, "Someone who knew me better than I knew myself." Later that night, he walked past the old brownstone they'd once considered buying, back when things were still intact. He imagined Melissa sitting on the front steps, reading, barefoot. He didn't text her. He had learned that healing meant knowing the difference between reaching out and pulling someone back. Parallel lives, they kept orbiting each other in the same city, like constellations that once formed a single shape. Melissa passed a cafe and spotted him inside. He was smiling at a woman across the table, older, composed. A colleague, maybe, or more. She didn't feel jealous, just aware. Aware that the Simon inside that cafe wasn't entirely the Simon who betrayed her. He'd changed. Maybe she had too. That same week, Melissa went on her first date in over a year. A bookstore owner named Owen. Quiet, charming. They talked about poetry and solitude, and at the end of the night, he asked gently if he could see her again. She said, "Maybe." An unexpected letter one cold evening in March, Melissa came home to find an envelope under her door. No stamp, just her name. Inside was a handwritten letter, not from Simon, from Camilla. "Melissa, you don't know me, but I know you. I know the sound of your name when he said it in his sleep. I know the silence he carried after losing you. I was a mistake, his and mine. But I wasn't a ghost. And neither are you. He never stopped loving you. I don't say this to guilt you. I say it because you deserve to know that even in betrayal, some truths remain untouched. I've made peace with what I did. I hope someday you do too." Melissa read it twice, then burned it in the sink, not out of anger, but to let go of what didn't belong in her story anymore. A chance encounter. It was early spring when they saw each other again, at the opening of a local art exhibit that had always been their thing. Neither planned it, neither avoided it. Simon stood by a piece made entirely of shattered mirrors, glued back together. Melissa joined him quietly. He said, "Looks like us." She smiled faintly, still sharp in places, but still holding. They didn't talk long, just stood there, side by side, in the soft hum of conversation and clinking glasses. Then she said, "I have to go." He nodded, and this time, as she walked away, he didn't follow. Final scene months later, Melissa sat at her desk, finishing a book manuscript, rebuilding after ruin, love, betrayal, and the spaces we occupy. Memoir of sorts. Though the names were changed, the pain was not. Neither was the hope. In the acknowledgments, she wrote, "To the one who broke me open and taught me how to rebuild with softer hands." She didn't know if Simon would ever read it, But she knew she had finally told the truth. Not the whole story, just the parts that mattered. Ending, quiet, bittersweet, possible. Sometimes forgiveness isn't a door you walk through together. It's one you open alone, just wide enough to let the light in, and sometimes healing isn't returning to what was, but learning to live in what is and what might still be. By June, the city bloomed again. Windows thrown open, cafe tables spilling onto sidewalks, and couples walking hand in hand beneath the flowering dogwoods. Melissa often sat at the same cafe on Sundays, editing her manuscript, sipping her usual. An oat milk cappuccino with a sprinkle of cinnamon. The book was nearly done. An agent had reached out. A small press in Portland had shown interest. More than once she thought about sending an early copy to Simon. She didn't. Not because she didn't want to, but because she wasn't sure who she was trying to reach, the man she loved, or the version of him she had to leave behind. In therapy, she confessed something that had stayed with her since the letter from Camilla. "I'm not sure I'll ever be the kind of person who forgets." Her therapist had replied, "You don't have to forget to move on. You just have to stop bleeding from the memory." Simon's letter 1. Sunday, Melissa received a small parcel in the mail. No return address, but she recognized the handwriting. Immediately, slanted, meticulous. Inside was a hardcover edition of The Art of Loving by Erich Fromm. Simon had underlined one passage. "Love is the active concern for the life and the growth of that which we love." Tucked inside was a note. "I thought I understood love when I had you. I didn't. I do now. I'll never ask for a second chance. Only that you know this. I never stopped wishing for your joy, even when it meant it wouldn't include me. S." She read it twice, her fingers trembling. She didn't cry. She just sat, very still, holding the book to her chest like something fragile that had somehow survived the fire. New beginnings. By late summer, Melissa agreed to see Owen again. Not because she was ready to fall in love, but because she no longer feared what that might mean. They went slowly. Walks around Green Lake, Sunday farmers' markets, long, meandering talks about memory and music. He was patient, kind, not a replacement. Just a presence, a possibility. One evening, he asked, "Do you think you're still in love with him?" Melissa didn't lie. "Some days, yes, but it's different now. It's love in the rear view. Close enough to still see, but not enough to go back to." And Owen just nodded. That's an honest place to start. One last meeting. It wasn't planned. Simon and Melissa crossed paths again on a ferry ride to Bainbridge Island. She was heading to a book talk. He was visiting his sister. They sat together on the deck, the wind tugging at her scarf, the sound of the waves between them. They didn't talk much, just looked out over the water. Simon turned to her once and said, "You look like peace." Melissa turned toward him and said, "You look like someone who finally stopped running." They both smiled, the kind of smile that held no weight, just history, and a little grace. When the ferry docked, they walked off together, not hand in hand. Not anything that dramatic, just two people who had shared something sacred and painful and real, and survived. Final words. Months later, Melissa stood at her first book reading, sunlight spilling across the floor-to-ceiling windows of the Independent bookstore. When she finished reading the final passage, someone asked from the audience, "Do you believe love survives betrayal?" She paused, then answered, "I think love can survive anything, but the shape it takes afterward may not look like what we hoped. Sometimes it becomes something else. Forgiveness, understanding, a memory we carry kindly, and sometimes it becomes the silence that teaches us who we really are." Ending, quiet resolve. Not every love story ends in reunion. Some end in resilience. The courage to face each other honestly, to carry what was without letting it define what comes next. Melissa didn't know if she and Simon would ever speak again, but she knew this. The wound had closed, and the scar, it no longer hurt to touch. The seasons had turned again. Summer slipped into the gold-dappled hush of autumn. Leaves curled into flame on the sidewalks. The world prepared, once more, for stillness. Melissa sat on the porch of a modest lake house upstate, rented for a solo retreat to finish the final edits of her second book. The first had found surprising success, not bestseller fame, but meaningful reach. Readers wrote to her, women mostly, some men, stories of betrayal, survival, hesitation, letters full of underlined truths. But none struck her like the one she received a few weeks ago. A message forwarded by her publisher. Your book helped me understand the woman I hurt. I don't expect forgiveness, but I'm trying to become the kind of man who would have deserved it. Thank you for the mirror. It could have been anyone, but she knew who it was. Melissa folded the letter carefully and tucked it between the pages of her journal. She didn't write back. Some goodbyes don't need punctuation, just peace. Simon. Now Simon no longer flinched when he heard her name. He no longer replayed that night on the balcony like a tragic loop. He still worked in cybersecurity, now consulting more than managing. He had carved out a slower life, mornings with tea instead of black coffee, afternoons spent in sunlit libraries, researching human error and behavioral design. He had begun journaling. Therapy, still. He was learning how not to turn guilt into identity. There was someone new, but not serious, a painter named Lucia. She liked the way he listened. He liked the way she never asked about his past unless he offered it. Sometimes, he told her about Melissa, not in detail, but enough. She taught me how to hold silence when it mattered, he once said. Lucia had nodded thoughtfully. Sounds like love. A new path for Melissa at a book event in Toronto. Melissa was invited to speak on emotional resilience in the digital age. Afterward, a man approached her. Late 30s, intelligent eyes, gentle voice. I'm Daniel. I run a support group for men recovering from infidelity. The kind they caused. Your book changed the way we talk about accountability. She blinked, caught off guard. Most of the stories out there are about what's done to us. Yours somehow let us see what it means to do the hurting and still try to be better. They shared coffee that evening, and though it wasn't romantic, something in her shifted. There were good men, flawed ones, real ones, and maybe slowly she was learning how to see them again. Final scene, crossing paths, one last time a conference in New York. Different venues, different events. Pure coincidence, Melissa, speaking on truth-telling in memoir. Simon speaking on emotional intelligence in leadership. She spotted him across the lobby. He saw her at nearly the same moment. The crowd dissolved into white noise. They met halfway, instinctively. Melissa broke the silence first. You look well. Simon smiled. So do you. I read your second book. Did it make you cry? She teased softly. A little, he admitted. There was a pause. Not heavy, just full. She placed a hand briefly on his arm. You were a chapter, a hard one, but not the ending. Simon's voice was quiet. I know, and I'm grateful for every page. They didn't say goodbye. They just drifted back into the current of their separate lives. Two people who had loved, broken, and somehow quietly come through the storm. Final words. Open, honest, human. Love doesn't always come back the way we think. Sometimes it comes back as closure, as growth, as the ability to sit beside your past without flinching. Melissa kept writing. Simon kept healing. And in the echo of what they lost, they each found something deeper, a truer self, a softer future, and the courage to begin again. The lake house had become more than a retreat. It was now Melissa's home. The city had grown too loud, too fast, too haunted by memory. She needed space, silence, room to expand. The lake gave her that. Water had a way of holding pain without drowning you. Her second and third books had done well. Not commercially. She was never that kind of writer. But they found hearts to settle in. One had been translated into Italian. The other taught in a few university classrooms under a course called Narratives of Loss and Renewal. She taught part-time now, creative nonfiction. Her students were bright-eyed, raw, too eager to turn pain into metaphor before they understood. And she always told them the same thing. Don't write to be understood. Write to understand yourself. Owen, he was still in her life, though they had parted ways gently years ago. He had wanted children, a family. Melissa had come close, to wanting it too, but something never quite clicked. It wasn't about Simon. Not entirely. She'd once told Owen, I don't think I'm built for forever with anyone, but I am built for truth, and I'd rather give you that than lie and wear a white dress. He'd kissed her forehead, called her brave, and left with dignity. They still exchanged holiday cards. This year, his card had a photo of two little girls in matching blue scarves and an Irish setter sprawled across the porch. She smiled when she opened it, genuinely happy for him. She didn't flinch. Simon. A quiet redemption. Simon had eventually remarried. Not Lucia, though they'd stayed close for a while, but a woman named Erin, an investigative journalist he met through a panel on digital ethics. She had fire in her voice and steel in her spine. They lived in Oregon now. He consulted occasionally, but mostly wrote essays on personal transformation and the philosophy of repair. He never named names. But readers who paid attention could hear Melissa in the subtext. He had a son now. Jonah. One night, while rocking Jonah to sleep, Simon stared out into the dark and whispered, You don't know this yet, but the hardest thing you'll ever do is forgive yourself. When you figure out how, everything else becomes possible. An unsent letter. Melissa once wrote Simon a letter. She never mailed it. Dear S, it's strange how far we've come. I thought healing would look like forgetting, but instead it looks like remembering without breaking. You changed me. In ways I never asked for. And in ways I might even be grateful for now. I don't wish you back, but I do wish you well. M. She folded it into her journal, tucked it behind an old pressed tulip, and let it stay there. Sometimes, closure isn't about sending the letter, it's about knowing you could. A student asks, during a late autumn class, a young woman raised her hand. Professor Hart, do you believe people who betray us can ever truly change? Melissa looked at the student. Her face was open, vulnerable, maybe a little bruised from something recent. Melissa thought of Simon, of the pain, the years, the healing. And then she answered carefully. Yes, but change isn't the same as erasure. We don't love the person they became. We love the one who hurt us. That's where the conflict lives. Some people change, some don't. What matters more is whether you change, whether you stop building homes in places already burned to ash. The room was quiet, and Melissa knew they weren't just hearing her. They were feeling it. Final scene, a memory. Without pain, Melissa stood on the dock of the lake house as the sun dipped behind the pines, casting long amber streaks across the water. She held a mug of tea, the air crisp with the coming cold. In the quiet, she thought of all the versions of herself, the woman who had been broken, the one who had burned with rage, the one who had written her way out of it all. She thought of Simon, of Owen, of love that came and went, not as punishment or reward, but as passage. She didn't long for anyone, just the stillness, and in that stillness she knew. Some stories don't end with a kiss. They end with a woman standing by the water, whole, healed, and finally unafraid of what comes next. At 15, Jonah Vance was sharp-eyed and quiet, a blend of both his parents. He had Aaron's pointed questions and Simon's watchful stillness. He rarely asked about the past, but he felt its shape, like a ghost humming in the spaces between words. One evening, as rain peppered the roof of their Oregon home, he came into the den where Simon sat reading. "Dad," he said, "can I ask you something?" "Weird." Simon lowered the book. "Always." Jonah hesitated, then asked, "Have you ever seriously hurt someone you loved?" The room contracted for a moment. Simon breathed in, carefully, as if that single inhale held the weight of a decade. "Yes," he said finally. Jonah studied him, eyes searching. "Did they forgive you?" Simon didn't lie. "I don't know if they ever truly did. But they let go. And that was enough to let me become someone better." Jonah was silent for a long beat. "Is that why you write those essays? About people fixing themselves?" Simon smiled gently. "It's why I started. Now I write them so someone else doesn't feel as lost as I once did." Jonah nodded. The question had been answered. Or maybe it hadn't, but it had settled something. He left, the echo of his father's truth quietly following him down the hall. Melissa receives a letter. It arrived on a Wednesday, unsigned. A typewritten envelope. A single page. "Dear M, I met your ex-husband today. I think he's raising a boy who will grow up knowing how to speak softly when it counts. I thought you'd want to know." A stranger who thinks healing echoes. She stared at the paper for a long time. Then she folded it, tucked it into the back of her journal, next to the letter she never sent Simon. And later that night, when her fingers hovered over the keyboard of a new manuscript, the words came easily. The working title was The Weight of Unsent Letters. Aaron's discovery. Aaron was digging through an old moving box one rainy afternoon when she found it, an old notebook of Simon's, not hidden, just forgotten. Most of it was journaling from years ago, before her, after Melissa. Pages full of regret, slow realizations, and self-interrogation. But one entry stopped her. "She didn't forgive me, and maybe she shouldn't have. But if there's a heaven in this life, it's found in knowing someone once loved you at your worst, and still chose for a while to stay." She closed the notebook gently, not with jealousy, with understanding. Later, she left Simon a note of her own. "You've come a long way. I'm glad I met you on the other side." He found it on his pillow, pressed a kiss to her temple that night, and held her like he knew exactly what grace meant now. Melissa's legacy. Melissa passed away quietly at 76, in the same lake house she had filled with books, laughter, and the occasional storm. She never remarried, not because she hadn't loved again, but because she'd learned that solitude, when chosen, could be its own kind of wholeness. At her memorial, attended by former students, readers, friends, and a few quiet ghosts from the past, a letter was read aloud, one she'd left behind. "To those I've loved, and those I've hurt, and those who've hurt me, thank you for the lessons. Pain taught me to write. Healing taught me to stay. Silence taught me to speak. In the end, I believe the most courageous thing we can do is not love blindly, but love honestly, even if it means letting go." Simon sat near the back of the service, a quiet presence. Jonah sat beside him, grown now. Aaron held Simon's hand. None of them cried. But when they walked out into the cool autumn air, Simon looked at the lake stretching toward the horizon and whispered, "Thank you, Melissa." Jonah glanced at him. "Was she the woman you wrote?" About and after the wreck? Simon gave a small, bittersweet smile. The first one, the blueprint. Final Line's life doesn't always give us closure. Sometimes it gives us echoes, soft and persistent, guiding us forward, reminding us where we've been. And sometimes, if we're lucky, it gives us a second chance not to rewrite the past, but to honor it by living better. She was 29, a visiting lecturer at a small liberal arts college in upstate New York, and she still kept her worn-out copy of The Cartography of Silence on her nightstand. Melissa Hart had been more than a mentor to her. She'd been the voice that pulled Ava back from the brink during a chaotic chapter of her own life. Ava had once emailed Melissa late at night after a betrayal of her own, asking, "How do you trust again after someone tears the ground out from under you?" Melissa had responded with a single line, "You don't rebuild the same house. You build a better one, brick by honest brick." Years later, long after Melissa's death, Ava found herself teaching a course called Truth in Nonfiction, Writing Through Betrayal and Recovery. And one day, while sifting through the university archives for a lecture on legacy writers, she came across something unexpected, a donation from Melissa's estate, a locked box labeled simply Unpublished, Unsent. It took her weeks to get clearance to view it. But when she did, her hands trembled. Inside were dozens of letters, unsent, unspoken, and unresolved. One to a man named Simon Vance, another to a woman named Lucia, several with no names at all, just dates and aching honesty. Each letter was a chapter of Melissa's heart, peeled open and left raw. Ava read them slowly, reverently. She wasn't sure if she was intruding on something sacred or being handed a responsibility. In the final envelope was a note, addressed not to anyone from the past, but to someone in the future. To the one who finds this, these letters were never meant to wound, only to witness. If you choose to share them, do so gently. Let them be reminders that love can shatter us, yes, but also shape us. That even betrayal, in its jagged cruelty, can carve out space for something more honest to grow. I wrote these not because I couldn't speak them aloud, but because sometimes writing is the only place we can tell the truth before we're ready to live it. Do with them what feels right. M. Ava spent the next year compiling the letters, annotating them, and crafting a narrative of Melissa's life through her own unsent truths. The resulting book was called What We Never Say, The Letters of Melissa Hart. It became a quiet sensation, passed hand to hand by therapists, writers, survivors of betrayal, people who knew the ache of silence and the strange comfort of a voice that said, "Me too." Jonah. Again, Jonah read the book in a single sitting. He closed the final page, breath held, then picked up his phone and called his father. "I just finished What We Never Say," he said. Simon was quiet. "I haven't. Read it." Jonah nodded into the phone. "You should. She didn't hate you. She saw you. Even in the end." Simon's voice cracked. "And what did she say?" Jonah answered gently. "That you changed. That maybe love wasn't about staying, but about witnessing someone's truth and not turning away." Simon exhaled. A long silence followed. Then, Jonah said, "I think you both saved each other, in your own ruined way." Last scene. The dock. Again, Ava visited the lake house once, years later, now owned by a local historical trust dedicated to literary legacies. She stood on the dock where Melissa had likely stood hundreds of times before. The water shimmered with early morning light. She imagined the writer here, older, wiser, softer, not broken, just unfinished in all the ways that made her beautiful. Ava pulled out her notebook and wrote a single line. "Some lives aren't cautionary tales. They're blueprints for becoming." She smiled. And somewhere, whether in memory, in words, or in something more eternal. Melissa Hart smiled back. The end. Lucia Diaz had always been the one who stayed on the fringes of every conversation, the quiet one in the corner whose thoughts were too heavy to share. She was the woman who never demanded attention, and in the chaos of Melissa's relationships, that was her greatest strength and her deepest curse. Her first memory of Melissa wasn't a grand one. It was an ordinary evening in a dimly lit cafe where they'd first met. Lucia had been there alone, nursing a half-empty cup of tea, when Melissa had sat down uninvited across from her. "Are you going to write that novel you're always talking about?" Melissa had asked, her voice a mix of challenge and curiosity. Lucia had been startled by the question, her heart lurching. She'd been talking about the book for years, but it had always been an idea that existed in the abstract, an unreachable goal. She was a student back then, a part-time assistant to a professor who spent her days organizing papers and her nights dreaming of what could be. I don't know," Lucia had stammered. "I think it's too much. Too hard." "Too hard doesn't matter," Melissa had replied, her eyes gleaming. "It just means it matters." In that moment, Lucia had felt something shift, something deep inside her. Melissa had spoken like someone who had lived through fires and come out stronger, even if she didn't admit it. That evening had marked the beginning of their complicated, often unspoken connection. The affair. That wasn't the affair, at least the affair everyone talked about, had never been what people thought. For a long time, Lucia had kept that secret buried deep inside her, tangled in the fabric of her own confusion and guilt. It wasn't that she hadn't loved Simon. She had, in a way. But it was a kind of love that never fully bloomed, never went beyond the realm of what-ifs. She was always waiting for something that never quite arrived, and when it did, it was a tangled mess of timing, miscommunication, and emotional exhaustion. She'd loved Simon for his quiet strength, for the way he spoke of his past and the way he looked at the future, a future that seemed uncertain, just like hers. But the affair had started in an unremarkable way. Late-night talks at the house Melissa had invited her to stay in, after a string of bad decisions in her own life. Conversations about loss, betrayal, redemption, things they both understood intimately. Those talks had turned into something else, slowly, imperceptibly. A shared moment of vulnerability between two women who had both been broken by the same man in different ways. Lucia had never seen herself as the other woman, but sometimes the weight of it sat on her chest like a stone. She had been there just when Melissa needed her the most. She had been the soft place to land when the world had betrayed them both. But what had it truly meant? In the years following Melissa's death, Lucia didn't talk about it. She couldn't. The shame of it still lingered, but it wasn't the kind of shame she could share. No one understood how complicated the lines were, how the boundaries had blurred until it was too late. But Melissa had known. She had always known. A letter, unwritten. One day, while packing up her apartment in the city, Lucia found it. A crumpled piece of paper hidden in the back of an old drawer. A letter Melissa had written to her. "Lucia, there's a truth between us that doesn't need to be said. Not because it's a secret, but because we both understand it without words. I don't know if I can ever fully forgive myself for the things I've done. But I know this. What happened between us, the way we sought comfort in each other's arms, it wasn't the affair people will make it out to be. You were never my enemy. I wonder if you'll ever forgive me for dragging you into this mess. But I know you. You never held grudges. Maybe that's why I love you in the way I do. M." Lucia sat on the floor, the letter in her trembling hands. She had never expected this. A part of her had always wondered if Melissa truly understood, truly saw her. But this letter, This fragile, unspoken acknowledgement finally gave her the closure she needed, even if she had never asked for it. A new beginning. Lucia moved back to a quiet town in Northern California shortly after reading the letter. She couldn't stay in the city anymore, not with the weight of the past still pressing down on her. She started writing, not just to fill the silence, but to purge the ghosts that clung to her. She wrote about betrayal, about silence, about the complicated, messy nature of love. She wrote about the kind of relationships that weren't easy to label, about how the world likes to simplify things when the truth is so much more layered. Her first novel, Unspoken Truths, became a quiet success in literary circles. It was a raw exploration of the ways people hurt each other and the long, slow process of healing. But it was also a story of forgiveness, not of the grand gestures, but of the tiny moments that make healing possible. It was the kind of story that didn't offer easy answers, only questions about the nature of love and whether it was possible to truly move on from the past. And for the first time in a long while, Lucia felt at peace. The final reflection. A few years later, Lucia sat at her desk in a small cottage by the sea, finishing the final draft of her second book. As she looked out over the ocean, she thought of Melissa, of Simon, of all the people who had touched her life in ways she would never fully understand. She thought about forgiveness, about love, about how everything in life was a form of redemption, even betrayal, even the quiet, unspoken connections that lingered beneath the surface. As she closed her laptop, she whispered to no one in particular, "I hope you found your peace, Melissa. I hope we all did." And with that, she went back. To work, writing, living, letting go. The end. Jonah stood at the edge of the lake, his feet sinking slightly into the damp earth. It was spring again, the air heavy with the scent of wet grass and the remnants of a long winter. His fingers gripped the edge of a crumpled letter in his hand. One he hadn't intended to read, but had found buried among his father's things when he'd gone through the attic last winter. He didn't know what he expected when he opened it, certainly not this. The letter was from Melissa. Jonah, if you're reading this, you found the piece of me I never shared. The piece I couldn't share, not because I didn't want you to know, but because I was afraid of what it would mean. You're the son I never gave birth to, but sometimes I wonder if it wasn't my fault for not allowing myself to be the kind of mother you needed. Your father and I tried to shield you from the mess we were, but I've come to realize there's no shielding a child from the damage of love's consequences. I hope one day you'll find a way to forgive me, for Simon, for the things we never spoke about. I never expected forgiveness from anyone, least of all from you. But if there's any chance for us to find peace, maybe it starts here. M. The Phi. Words pressed into him like a physical weight. Jonah had spent years avoiding the reality of his parents' fractured love story, pretending it was all just a sad chapter of the past that didn't belong to him. But now, standing here at the same lake where his father and Melissa had once tried, and failed, to rebuild their lives, Jonah couldn't ignore the rawness of what they had lived through. He didn't know if he could forgive Melissa. Hell, he wasn't sure he could forgive his father. But one thing was certain. He couldn't continue carrying the weight of their mistakes without understanding them. Jonah exhaled slowly, staring out over the water. The world felt impossibly quiet, as if it were holding its breath, waiting for something that wasn't yet ready to be said. It wasn't just his parents' story he had inherited. It was his own. The very same complex, messy, untold parts of love that had shaped them were in him, too. Ava's second book. Ava had never anticipated the impact her first book would have. What We Never Say had grown in readership steadily, from a small literary audience to a more mainstream following. But as the book entered its second year of publication, she found herself suddenly flooded with messages, from people she'd never met, telling her how Melissa's letters had changed their perspective on their own painful relationships. One such message had come from a woman in Oregon, a single mother who'd been in an abusive relationship and found strength in Melissa's words about healing. Another was from a college professor in Chicago who'd been estranged from his parents for years, but after reading Melissa's letters, had reached out to reconcile. Yet, the most haunting message came from a man named Jacob. He had written a single desperate line in his email. "You don't know me, but I'm Simon Vance's son. I found my father's letter to Melissa. What am I supposed to do now?" Ava had stared at the screen for a long time, trying to figure out what to say to this young man. She didn't know if she was qualified to offer any guidance, but something in her knew she couldn't ignore this. She wrote back. "Jacob, first, let me say that finding a letter, something so private and intimate, is always a shock. You may feel a sense of invasion, confusion, and perhaps even anger. But what I would encourage you to remember is this. Melissa's legacy wasn't one of simple answers, but of understanding the complexities of love. It's clear that Simon, your father, was a man who lived with contradictions. But so are we all. I hope you can allow yourself the space to ask the difficult questions, but also to listen to your own heart, which may lead you toward a truth you didn't expect. Be kind to yourself in this. Ava." A few days later, Jacob replied, "Ava, I don't know what to make of all this yet, but you're right. It feels like there's more to Simon than I knew, maybe more than he even realized. Thank you for listening. Jacob." The exchange felt strange, almost unreal. Ava knew she had touched something deep, something broken. But she also knew it was part of the process of healing, of moving forward. Lucia's quiet reconciliation. Lucia, now in her early 40s, sat in the same cottage by the sea, a copy of Unspoken Truths resting on her lap. She hadn't expected the book to be such a success. When she first wrote it, it had been an attempt to understand the mess of her past. But the process of sharing those truths, of inviting others to look into her life, had unexpectedly been a form of release. She still thought of Melissa from time to time, though not as often as before. The memories were gentler now, worn smooth by the years. She had, after all, spent years grappling with guilt, questioning whether she had done enough to make things right. But time, it seemed, had a way of softening even the hardest edges. It was a rainy afternoon when the letter came. A simple envelope with no return address. Inside, there was a photograph of Melissa's lake house, faded with age, along with a short note. "Lucia, I was thinking of you today, and I hope, wherever you are, you've found some peace." As Lucia sat back, her heart aching with something she couldn't quite place. It wasn't exactly forgiveness that she felt, but rather a deep, quiet understanding. Simon had always been a man of few words, but this small gesture, this acknowledgement, spoke volumes. She placed the letter on the windowsill, watching the rain blur the view of the ocean. Maybe this was how it was supposed to end, not in dramatic confession or bitter confrontation, but in simple, quiet reconciliation. Jonah and the future Jonah returned to his apartment, the letter still clutched in his hand. There was so much he still didn't understand, so much he was still trying to make sense of. But for the first time in a long time, he didn't feel like the past had him in a chokehold. The weight wasn't as suffocating anymore. He had a long road ahead, one that involved confronting not just his parents' past, but his own. There were conversations that needed to be had, apologies that might never come, and wounds that might never fully heal. But Jonah finally understood that forgiveness wasn't a final destination. It was a process, a messy, painful, beautiful journey. He sat at his desk, pulling out his own journal and beginning to write. Forgiveness is not something you find at the end of a story. It's something you learn to live with, piece by fragile piece. It wasn't an answer, but it was a beginning. The end. Jonah couldn't stop writing. At first, it was sporadic, random thoughts, angry rants, pieces of memories that slipped out of him like fragments of broken glass. But as the days passed, the writing became more structured. It wasn't just a release. It was a process. He'd begun to understand through his words the parts of himself that had been hidden or neglected for so long. He wrote about his father, Simon, the man who had taught him so much but also failed him in ways he couldn't ignore. He wrote about Melissa, a woman he had never really known, yet whose choices had shaped his life. And then he wrote about himself, the son trying to find his way in a world where the lines between right and wrong were often blurred. Each evening, he sat at his desk, notebook open, as the world outside grew darker, the sounds of the city fading into the background. The words didn't come easily, but they came, sometimes jagged and raw, other times soft and quiet. It was as though each sentence held a mirror up to him, showing him parts of his soul that he had long avoided. The night he wrote the last line of the first chapter, Jonah allowed himself a small, rare smile. He had started this journey not knowing where it would lead, but for the first time in years, he felt a sense of direction. He wasn't just chasing ghosts from the past anymore. He was reclaiming pieces of himself that had been lost. Ava's challenge for Ava, the journey was no less complicated. The book had brought her success, yes, but it had also opened doors to questions she wasn't prepared to answer. She often found herself staring at her own reflection, wondering if the person she had become was really the person she had set out to be. There had been no grand reconciliation with Simon, no dramatic closing of their shared chapter. What remained was an unspoken understanding that he had chosen to stay in the shadows of their past, and she had chosen to let him. But then there was Jacob, the son who had reached out to her. His voice, still raw with confusion and pain, had forced her to confront parts of her own story she had hoped to leave behind. She had tried to avoid the responsibility of offering him guidance, but it was clear that Jacob needed someone who understood the complexities of the love his father had for Melissa. One afternoon, as she walked through her favorite cafe, she spotted him, Jacob, sitting alone at a corner table, his face more weary than she'd imagined. He was holding a book, What We Never Say. Ava hesitated, then made her way over to him. "Jacob?" she asked, her voice soft. He looked up, his eyes a mirror of the pain she'd seen in his emails. "Ava," his voice was hesitant, unsure. I didn't expect you to show up." She smiled gently, sitting across from him. "I've been thinking about our conversation and about your father. If you're open to it, I'd like to help you find some peace." Jacob nodded, his hand tightening around the book. "I've been reading the letters, trying to understand why he chose not to tell me about them. About Melissa." Ava took a deep breath. "It's complicated. But I think it's important to know that love, especially the kind Simon had for Melissa, wasn't easy for him to explain. He wasn't just hiding things from you. He was hiding things from himself, too." "I don't know if I can forgive him," Jacob admitted, "but I need to understand him, the man he was, before I can even begin to move on." Ava watched. Him, her heart heavy with the weight of her own experiences. "That's the first step, Jacob. Understanding. The rest will come, eventually." As they sat there in silence, Ava realized something that surprised her, a small but significant shift in her heart. She was no longer afraid of her own past, and perhaps neither was Jacob. Lucia's return to the stage. Lucia's days of retreating from the world had long passed. She had spent years processing the loss of her relationship with Simon, with Jonah, and the way their lives had splintered in ways that seemed too painful to reconcile. But now she found herself at a crossroads, no longer content to simply observe from the sidelines. It had been years since her last performance, but the call had come in unexpectedly. A renowned theater company wanted her to return, to bring back the role she had once made famous. She had declined at first, unsure if the stage would offer her the same sense of fulfillment it once had. But then, one night, as she sat alone, with her thoughts, she realized the stage was more than just a career. It was a part of who she was, a part of her that had been stifled for too long. So she agreed. The rehearsals were intense, and as she threw herself back into her craft, she felt something shift within her. The role required her to channel a version of herself that she hadn't accessed in years. The passionate, driven woman who had once fought for love, for her career, for the things she wanted without reservation. But each line she spoke, each moment on stage, reminded her of the person she had once been. And in that mirror of her past, Lucia found something new, a version of herself that had learned from her mistakes, that had made peace with her past, while still holding on to the pieces of herself that were worth saving. It wasn't about forgiveness. Not exactly. It was about reclaiming her own narrative, her own voice. The unanswered question Jonah's manuscript was growing piece by piece as he explored his parents' lives. His exploration of their mistakes, their choices, and their love had become more than just an act of understanding. It had become an act of healing. But he couldn't help but wonder, would it ever be enough? Would there ever be a moment where the ghosts of his past, of his parents, would finally leave him in peace? As he sat at his desk one night staring at the words on the page, his phone buzzed. A message. Jonah, I don't expect you to forgive me, but I think you should know that. Melissa is finally ready to tell you the truth. I'll be in town next week. If you're willing to listen, I think you'll finally understand why I did the things I did. Simon. Jonah stared at the screen, the weight of the message sinking into him. He had been so certain that the past was behind him, that he had moved forward. But now, it seemed, the past was pulling him back. Would he go? Could he sit across from the man who had broken him, who had lied to him, and listen to the truth that had been hidden for so long? The answer wasn't clear. But one thing was, Jonah wasn't running anymore. The end, for now. Jonah sat in his apartment, the dim light from the street below casting shadows on the walls. The message from Simon had rattled him in a way he hadn't expected. For years, he'd convinced himself that there was no more to be said between them, that the man who had been his father was gone, along with the relationship they once had. Yet here was Simon, reaching out, promising that there was more to their story, that something had been hidden for all these years. The idea of seeing Simon again filled Jonah with dread, but also a strange sense of curiosity. Was this his chance to understand, or was it simply another chapter in a long history of deceit? He didn't know, but the need for answers gnawed at him, and despite everything, a small part of him still longed for some semblance of closure. He leaned back in his chair, staring at the phone screen as if it were a window into some far-off world. Could he do this? Could he sit face to face with the man who had betrayed him so many times and somehow find the strength to hear him out? Or was it just a trap, a final attempt by Simon to manipulate his son into forgiveness? Jonah's hand hovered over the phone, ready to text Simon back, but the words wouldn't come. He put the phone down instead, taking a deep breath. His mind raced through the possibilities. What if Simon's explanation could give him peace? What if it could help him understand the twisted love that had bound Simon and Melissa? Finally, Jonah made a decision. The past had shaped him, but it didn't define him. Whatever happened next, He would face it on his own terms. He stood up, grabbed his jacket, and walked out of the apartment, heading toward the address Simon had sent him. Ava's crossroads Ava, too, was standing at a crossroads, but hers was more a matter of what to do with the growing responsibility she had taken on. Jacob had continued to reach out, his emotional state hanging in a delicate balance. As much as Ava had tried to help him navigate the complexities of his father's past, there was a growing sense that she was becoming entangled in a situation far more complicated than she had originally anticipated. Her role in all of this was not clear-cut. She had always considered herself a bystander, an observer of the mess Simon had created, but now she was becoming an active participant in trying to help Jacob find answers. In the process, she was finding herself reconsidering her relationship with her own past, with Simon, and with her role as a mother figure to a son who wasn't hers by blood, but who had been affected by the same fractures in her family. The more she thought about it, the more she realized that she hadn't been entirely honest with herself. She hadn't fully forgiven Simon, nor had she truly accepted her part in the messy web of lies that had kept them all bound together for so many years. And in the midst of helping Jacob, Ava found herself asking a question that had haunted her for decades. Could she ever forgive Simon for the betrayal he had orchestrated? Could she ever forgive herself for not walking away sooner? Ava was sitting at her kitchen table, staring at the unfinished manuscript of her next book, when her phone rang. The name on the screen made her pause. It was Simon. She had expected this. The truth had always been elusive, and now, after all these years, Simon was finally ready to speak. She answered the call, her fingers trembling slightly. Ava. Simon's voice was low, tentative. I've been thinking a lot about what you said, about the past and the future. Ava's heart skipped a beat, but she didn't let her emotions show. What do you want, Simon? I need to talk, he said, his voice thick with unspoken emotion. I don't know if you'll forgive me, but I owe you that much. I owe you the truth. The air between them was heavy with everything that had been left unsaid for so long. Ava closed her eyes, imagining the face of the man who had once meant everything to her, and yet, in the same breath, had betrayed her in ways she had never fully understood. I'm listening, she said quietly, her voice unwavering. Lucia's. Return to the spotlight. Lucia's first performance after her return to the stage was nothing short of electric. The theater buzzed with anticipation as the audience filed into their seats, the sound of murmurs filling the air. Lucia had always been able to command the room, but tonight there was something different. It wasn't just the return to her craft. It was the return to herself. She stood backstage, taking a deep breath as the final moments of silence before the performance stretched out. She felt the weight of the audience's expectations, but it wasn't fear she felt. It was empowerment. For years, Lucia had avoided the stage because it felt like a part of her that was too vulnerable to expose again. But tonight, as the curtain rose and the first line of the play echoed through the theater, Lucia realized she had never truly lost the magic. She was the same woman with the same fire, only now she was no longer apologizing for it. Her character, broken, yearning, full of passion, was a reflection of the journey she had taken. She poured everything into the performance, each word, each movement a release of all the pent-up emotions she had hidden for so long. The audience was captivated, but it was the raw vulnerability she revealed on stage that left her feeling truly free. By the end of the performance, the applause was deafening. Lucia stood there, a smile tugging at her lips, but there was a moment, a pause as she caught her breath, that made her realize something. The theater had always been her home, and no matter how much she had run from her past, she had never stopped needing it. The meeting. The cafe was quiet when Jonah arrived. The sunlight streamed through the windows, casting a soft, almost serene light over the room. He was early, but Simon had always been a man of punctuality. Jonah's stomach was tight, the anticipation of the conversation pressing on him like an invisible weight. When Simon finally walked in, his face was as worn as Jonah remembered, but there was a tiredness in his eyes that made Jonah's heart ache. Was it regret? Or simply the years catching up with him? They didn't speak at first. Jonah stood to greet him, but Simon gestured for him to sit. The weight of the years between them was palpable. Finally, Simon broke the silence. Jonah, I've been a coward for too long, and I don't expect you to understand, but there are things about your mother, about Melissa, that you don't know, things I kept hidden, even from myself. Jonah's chest tightened, but he didn't interrupt. He had been waiting for this, waiting for Simon to finally say the words he had been longing to hear. But what did they mean? Was this really the truth, or just another lie wrapped in a new package? Simon's voice wavered as he continued. I thought I was protecting you, but I wasn't. I was only protecting myself. Jonah leaned forward, his hands shaking slightly. Protecting yourself from what? From the truth? Simon's gaze dropped, and for a moment, Jonah saw the man who had failed him, the man who had kept secrets for far too long. The question hung in the air. Could Jonah hear him out, or would this meeting be the final chapter of their story? The unanswered future. The future hung in uncertainty, suspended like the threads of a delicate web. Jonah, Ava, and Lucia were all in the midst of a journey shaped by love, betrayal, and the possibility of something more. Whether they would find closure, forgiveness, or a new beginning was still unknown. What was certain was that their paths had crossed for a reason, and as they moved forward, they would find that the pieces of their broken lives could either come together to heal or splinter once more. The end, or is it?